We'll give it a few more seconds to let everyone get in here. Oh, good evening, everyone, and welcome to In the Adirondack Library Series for February. I'm Joe Dolan from the Adirondack Experience in Blue Mountain Lake. The Adirondack Experience Library, as you know, is the largest, most comprehensive repository of books, manuscripts, maps, and government documents, all relating to the history of the Adirondacks. So we're excited in this series to bring you inside the library, at least virtually, to explore Adirondack life, history, and culture. The series runs through May, so I hope you'll continue to join us on the first Monday of each month to hear from some fantastic authors based in the Adirondack North Country region. More information about the books, the authors, and the whole schedule is online at theadkx.org. Our interviewer for tonight and throughout the series is Mitch Tyke, station manager of North Country Public Radio and host of North Words. North Words airs the fourth Friday of each month on NCPR and features interviews, on-site recordings, and special features that remind us of what makes the North Country a special and unique place to be. More information on NCPR and North Words can be found at ncpr.org. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's featured author, Stephen Cernick. Stephen was raised in Corinth and worked 5 summers for International Paper at his hometown's Hudson River Mill through college. After earning a PhD, he taught American history at several New England colleges. And since the closure of the Hudson River Mill in 2002, he has published several articles on the early history of pulp and paper industry and the cultural history of the Upper Hudson River. The Beater Room Boys, growing up in an Adirondack mill town, and Hudson River Reflections, the peculiar history of an Adirondack mill town, were published in 2024. And you can find both of his books online at our store and probably at your local library. So in a moment, I'll turn it over to Stephen. He'll provide a brief overview of his book and presentation. Mitch will then join in with some questions, and we'll finally wrap up with some questions from the audience. And on that note, we welcome your participation at any time through the program. Use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Click that button and type your question in at any time, and we'll get around to it. So also be sure to check the chat for important links. So with that, I'll give it over to Stephen.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate being here this evening. I'll just talk a little bit about the memoir and its origins and a little bit of background history and context for the paper industry in Corinth, but also its location in terms of the Hudson River and providing some sort of regional Adirondack context for the book and the way I wrote it. I should say that the book started out originally 20 years ago as a fictional piece that was based in the first summer I spent working at the Hudson River Mill in Corinth in 1969. I was going to use that summer and the men I met there, whose stories I heard as a context or pretext for writing about fictional stories about people I had heard about from these men I met in the mill. I wrote a little bit of a couple of chapters 20 years ago, and then in 2022, after having not done anything with it, picked it up again and decided to start working with it. And by that time, the Hudson River Mill in Corinth had closed. It was an international paper company mill, had operated for 133 years, and it was shuttered in 2002. And I was determined at that point that a memoir or a historical account of the 5 summers I worked there might be more valuable than a fictional account. I spent most summers between 69 and 1975. There were a few summers not working because work was slow and they weren't hiring any summer college work. But what I did with this memoir is not make it as much about me as trying to place that era into historical context, my experience both in the town uh, and growing up there, but also working in the mill in both national and community context. And as I started writing, the book grew organically, and I found myself going back into the 1960s and 50s, which I didn't plan to do. And 12 months later came out with the Beta Room Boys. The book, it really doesn't have a plan or a central thread or narrative. The first chapter, I create a context for the Blue Line. It's called Straddling the Blue Line, which is basically an effort to try to put Adirondack Milltown in context, which I'll talk about in a few seconds. The first chapters 2 through 8 talk mostly about growing up, my home, the street I grew up on, the kids I played with, going to elementary school, childhood memories that most people from that era would recognize. I've been told they're very familiar to other people of that era. There are about 10 chapters, 15 chapters on high school experience, including social activities and high school sports. And I put that high school experience into a community context, but also a historical context. As a historian, when I look back, I realized that I needed to sort of loop all that in to provide a basis for that time in which I went through school and grew up in the town of Corinth. Uh, the chapters, 6 chapters towards the end, deal with the summer of 1969 when I was a member of a crew of 5 guys who worked in the mill's beta room, which I'll talk about maybe a little bit later. And that was a critical part of my growing up, sort of following the footsteps of my father and grandfather. My grandfather started working in that mill in 1918, worked for 43 or 44 years. My father started in 1937 and retired in 1986. And so I was a third generation to work there, even though I wasn't a full-time employee in the way they and other men were. So I thought that the memoir would be important to write because there really hadn't been any account written, as far as I knew, of work in that mill. So I thought my account would be better than anything that we had, which at that point was really nothing. And so I thought a slightest contribution that I might make would be helpful. And then, of course, it centers not on the 5 summers I worked there, but on just the summer of 1969, which is a rich year, rich summer, 3 months of quite profound historical events. The Woodstock Music Festival was that summer. The Charles Manson killings were that summer. The moon landing was the summer of 69. The accident where Mary Jo Kopechne was killed at Chappaquiddick that pretty much ended Teddy Kennedy's political career was that summer. The Stonewall riots in Greenwich Village occurred that summer, which is arguably the touchstone of the beginning of the gay rights movement in the United States. And the film Midnight Cowboy was released in May of 1969. So when I looked at it, it was a very rich summer and decided to focus on that summer. And eventually, as I wrote the book, I ended up moving back into the 50s and 60s and trying to put that larger experience of growing up as a kid in a mill town in the southern Adirondacks into a better context. The last couple of chapters in the book deal with coming home. And when I tried to come back to Corinth after the mill closed in 2002 to provide some historical support to gathering and preserving some historical materials. In any event, I wanted to show, for those of you who don't know where Corinth is, this is a map of the Adirondack Park, and Corinth is in the very uh, uh, southeast corner of the park. And in fact, it wasn't originally in the park. It was brought in 1931 when the park was expanded to include Lake George and the Sacandaga Reservoir. And in fact, the Blue Line goes right through the middle of the village of Corinth. And interestingly enough, the Hudson River Mill, the pulp and paper mill, was located just outside the Blue Line here, and the Palmer Falls and the hydroelectric dam was located inside the Blue Line. And I've not yet sort of had the energy to try to figure out why that line was drawn that way, but it was cut right through the middle of the community. The thing about Corinth, and the reason I called it an Adirondack Mill town, is because it did derive its economic affluence over 133 years from the resources of the Adirondack, specifically the Hudson River. This is a view of Corinth looking north toward the foothills of the Adirondacks around 1960. So water power was critical. Palmer Falls, located on the Hudson and Corinth, has a fall of 87 feet, the highest on the entire river. So in addition, with water power, the resources of Adirondack timber, initially poplar and later spruce, these were the two ingredients that really made both Corinth and other Adirondack communities along the margins of the Adirondack Mountains part of the early pulp and paper industry, when wood pulp was initially used for paper making to replace the former material cotton and in some cases straw. So that happened about 1860, 1870. And so the entire industry relocated to the Northeast, and New York State, in fact, between 1880 and 1920 was the leading producer of pulp and paper in the United States. Now, flashing forward a little bit, this is the Hudson River Mill in around 1970 where I worked. You can see Palmer Falls, which has a big dam that was built in 1913, and the Palisades, which are remarkable stone outcroppings that go all the way along the river close to the village of Corinth. But this was a large plant. It produced about 600 tons of coated paper a day, and it provided the economic lifeblood to the entire community. So it was very much a mill town, even though when I grew up, no one referred to themselves as living in a mill town, nor did they ever refer to themselves as living in the Adirondacks. But we were very much a product of the Adirondack resources that drove the economy. Now, I want to say a little bit for those who might be interested in history. I wanted to show you some context. The site that I just showed you, Palmer Falls, over here, looked like this at one time. This is an early 1816 lithograph by Jacques Milbert. Corinth, in this location, could have easily been considered Adirondack primeval. In fact, it was in the lithographs that were done by Jacques Milbert and William Guy Wall in the early, late 18 teens. Both of them published portfolios in the 1820s to wide acclaim, and Wall's book, published in 1824, was received widely and promoted tourism in the southern Adirondacks as a result of some of the images that were in his book. So this was an early version of the river, of the falls, is captured by Wall and Milbert. And this whole section of the river was really the quintessential Adirondack wilderness in the 1820s and 30s. So this is his rapids above Hadley's. In those days, Palmer Falls was called Hadley Falls, and it changed names because it was purchased by a gentleman from New York City called Beriah Palmer in 1828. But early on, it was called Hadley Falls. So these are photographs, these are image lithographs that were published in the 1820s. It has that particular image, at least the Jacques Milbert version of that same landscape, was used by Carolyn Walsh and her book on Adirondack prints and printmakers several years ago, although probably most people didn't know where it was located, but it was been used to sort of signify this early pre-industrial Adirondack landscape. William Guy Wall also rendered Jessup Landing, which is now downtown Corinth. So village of Corinth, if you were driven through, was called Jessup's Landing until 1886, and it became the village of Corinth. And even Wall's rendering made it to the cover of Richard Gasson's book, Birth of American Tourism, which interestingly doesn't really talk about the landscape here or tourism in this region, but it pervades a very provocative appealing romantic landscape. So this place that became the site of this largest paper mill, in fact, the mill in Corinth by the 1890s was considered the largest pulp and paper mill in the United States, if not the world. But this, 60, 70 years later was a completely different landscape. And just in the advent of industrialization, John William Hill painted Palmer Falls in 1866. Now, what's interesting about this is that industry was going on in the margins, but Hill rendered them out of the scene. There was a woolen mill here and also an edge tool factory in 1866. Seneca Ray Stoddard also rendered that falls, but he conveniently left the woolen mill and the beginnings of the paper mill, pulp mill, out of the scene as well. But anyway, this is a landscape that was originally rendered as a primeval scene. And many people thought that the river couldn't be harnessed there because of the ledges and the rocks, and the fall couldn't be harnessed effectively for manufacturing purposes. But that changed around 1869. This is the beginning of the Hudson River Pulp Company, which laid its foundations there on the falls, below the falls in 1869. It grew very slowly. This is another sort of close-up of that image of its early pulp, wood pulp manufacturing site. And the paper mill was here. And this is a woolen mill down here that moved down and then eventually abandoned the site, and it was taken over by pulp and paper. Industry, for those of you who are not familiar with it, was driven by two technologies. One is a mechanical wood grinder, which ground Adirondack spruce into fiber that was made into pulp with water. And then it was pumped onto a four-denier paper machine, which you see here. So these two pieces of technology were the ones that were central to the 19th century paper industry, both in New York State and the Northeast, for that matter. And this is the Hudson River Pulp Company 30 years after. So this was in 1898, what the mill looked like at that spot at the time that International Paper Company was formed, and they bought 18 different companies throughout New England and New York State to form International Paper. So the cornerstone of that new company was this mill on the Hudson River in Corinth. And of course, it doesn't look all that different. This is 1965. So this would have been the mill when I worked there. And it has a tradition. By the time I worked there, there were 1,500 employees. Between 1955 and 65, about 1,500 employees worked there. International Paper was the economic lifeblood of the entire community. It was a vibrant community, and coupled with the Cluett Peabody shirt factory, which at one point might have employed as many as 300 people. The two manufacturing plants pumped the equivalent of $100 million into the economy every year in 2024 dollars. So this was a completely different world, and it was a mill town by any stretch of the imagination. So this would have the mill in full blossom in Palmer Falls over here, which of course is really not the falls anymore, but it's merely a dam. So in 1950, downtown Corinth looked like this. It was prosperous. I wouldn't say it would be affluent, but there were 8 or 9 restaurants and bars. There were 3 car dealerships. There were several barber shops, doctors and dentists. It was a very, very economically prosperous community. And it had been that way for most of the 20th century. Although the population grew, in fact, the population of the community before the paper industry came into Corinth was about 1,500, and it doubled within 30 years, and it grew exponentially as the mill grew. So this is Main Street in Corinth. This is the image that I used on the cover of the book. This industry grew in part because it eventually transitioned from the production of newsprint in the early 20th century to the production of coated papers. These would be magazine papers that have a coated glossy surface that hold ink well and also hold color well. And so that process started around 1940. It continued into the 1950s, and in 1958, this machine was installed by the Bell Light Corporation, and this was a state-of-the-art paper machine the International Paper Company put in here. And the paper roll was a 208 inches wide, and it produced a mile of paper every 2.5 minutes. So that was a state-of-the-art machine at that time. And going forward, that machine was never replaced. There was never a newer machine put in. And so that machine, when it shut down in 2002, was over 50 years old. But anyway, the point is that the production of coated papers became the lifeblood of this mill. The community was known throughout the publishing industry for producing the highest quality coated paper. In 1965, the number 11 machine made it to the front page of the New York Times in an article about the demand for newspaper and magazine paper. And so the mill was known far and wide. And I won't go into it here, but it is discussed in the Beaner Room Boys, is at the beginning of the mill's decline, its economic decline, is in about 1965. So the high water mark, both of the pulp and paper production at that mill, but also the economic prosperity of the community comes about 1965. And most people at that time weren't really fully aware of the gradual decline. But by 1970, that mill lost 500 jobs. So that was the beginning of the end, and it took a long, long time for it all to work out. So coated paper was critical to providing an economic affluence to the community. International paper also provided a very strong social and recreational influence. This building on the left is called the Community Building. It was built in 1922 to house men strikebreakers during the 1921 paper strike, and by the end of the 1920s, it became a community building. It had a gymnasium, it had a cafeteria, it had bowling alleys, it had a shooting range, and in the background, this building back here was the original office of the International Paper Company. It was this headquarters that it built in 1905. So in any event, the community building and the EMBA, the Employee Mutual Benefit Association, was an IP-funded social and recreational organization that was administered and managed by paper workers. And inside that building, throughout the winter months, was basketball games, adult and young boys, bowling alleys, archery, any number of things. The place was vibrant and full of kids all through the winter months. And then the EMBA also sponsored summer softball leagues, and they built a golf course in South Corinth eventually. So this was pretty important part of the community. And every year there would be an annual sports banquet held in the gymnasium. And this was, sadly, in retrospect, it was mostly a male-dominated circumstance. There were women were in bowling leagues and participated in archery, but the yearly sports banquet was pretty much a all-male event. And this is the NBA Sports Trophy Banquet Fishing Trophy winners, and this is yours truly winning a trophy for catching the largest bass that year, which happened to come out of Hunt Lake, if you've ever been to Hunt Lake. There are sections in the book also that talk about Catholicism. I grew up as a Catholic, and most of my friends were Catholic. There are 2 chapters in the book about growing up Catholic, going to catechism, dealing with that part of life in the community. There's a chapter on Corinth's priests, some of the more colorful characters that found their way to Corinth. This building is mentioned in a detail in several instances. This is the parish hall, which was Corinth's original Catholic church that was built in 1886. It was replaced by the brick church that I showed you, and it became a place for religious instruction. And there's a chapter in the book where a bunch of hormonal driven sophomores had a shoe fight in there with clothing that was collected for to be distributed to people who needed help with clothing and shoes and so forth. And so there's a really kind of a funny chapter section in the book. But the parish hall was really the center of religious life and social life. And many, many, many of my friends were Catholic. And so I write a little bit about that and its influence on us growing up, especially in terms of corporal punishment, which also is brought up here. This is Corinth Central School. I talk a lot about its influence growing up. It was basically all grades 2 through 12 were under the same roof for all intents and purposes. The elementary school over here and the high school, grades 7 through 12, used the same hallways, the same locker rooms, the same cafeteria, the same classrooms. So there's quite a bit discussion in there about school, in particular athletics, but mostly there are 2 chapters on corporal punishment, which was outlawed in New York State, I think in 1984 or 86. And so some of my more memorable experiences were observing the administration of corporal punishment, beginning with kindergarten, all the way up through, sophomore and junior year. In fact, when I posted a story about corporal punishment on a Facebook page, someone submitted this photograph. They had stolen, taken, I should say, a paddle from a teacher's classroom back in the early 1970s. And all these guys, I knew all these guys signed their name to this paddle. So this was a sort of a corporal punishment paddle that hung on a hook near a blackboard in one of the classrooms in Corinth High School, which was not uncommon. This was not unique to Corinth by any stretch of the imagination. As I've talked to people, I've heard horrific stories about corporal punishment in other schools and other communities. Sports was an important part of my life in high school. I talked quite a bit about it, not in a very flattering way, in terms of coaches and the way things were run. This is just a photograph of the freshman football team, which I found not too long ago. I was a member of this team. I'm up here. And I look at the photograph, and it's kind of difficult to look at because most of the boys in this photograph have passed away, and some just last year, in fact. So, in any event, sports was a very important part of life in Corinth in that year. So I try to write about it objectively and try to explain some of my experiences. I'm sure are not all that unusual. That people who played sports in the 60s and 70s in a small New York high school would recognize these experiences. Also, there were places in the community that were social centers. I write a whole chapter called 24 Oak Street about Lanfear's store, which was across the street from the school, and Ruth Lanfear, who managed this store, and she was like a mother to kids. And the place was full of kids in the morning before school, at lunchtime, after school, weekends. And so I had to speak about some great detail about this store. And this, I'm not sure they ever took a photograph of this with no one around it. Ruth Lanfear ran that store from the middle 1930s until 1980. So she became she was certainly a pillar of the community. Another location was the bathing beach on the Hudson River, which this is early 1960s. This was another important social center in the community during the summertime for teenage kids. If you live that this dock looks like it's about ready to tip over. In any event, I also talk about work. There were a lot of my friends had jobs in high school. I started working in ninth grade. There's a story about me working at the Catholic cemetery. Some funny stories about falling in a grave, which is a true story. I painted the cemetery fence one year with some friends, and then I was hired to be the caretaker of the cemetery when I was 15. And this vehicle, this Gravely tractor, which we can't see because the screen has images over it, was donated to the church, and I was in charge of mowing the cemetery lawn with this monstrous machine. And then I also worked at Gaslight Village one year. I talk a little bit about working there, and particularly administering and managing this ride called the Roundup, and I was 17 years old and ran that. And there's some funny stories about summer spent up working at Gaslight Village, which some of you may remember. It's now demolished and just a memory. The summer of '68, I was working in the Grand Union supermarket when word came that my classmate Bruce Colson was killed in Vietnam. Vietnam is an important part of the book as well. Bruce quit high school in our junior year, enlisted in the Marines, was in Vietnam within 2 weeks of finishing his basic training and was killed. And he was the only one in our class. There were other boys in Corinth who died in Vietnam. There were 4 total. But Bruce, it hit home, and I was still a junior in high school. The rest of us were juniors, and he was killed in Vietnam. It was kind of a jarring fact that brought home. So the war came home to Corinth with the death of Bruce Colson. And then finally, in 1968, the same year, I write at length about this Corinth sesquicentennial, its 150th year birthday, which was a year that most men in Corinth dressed up in turn of the century garb, I guess. I'm not sure what period this is, but grew facial hair, mustaches, and beards, and posed for photographs. In this particular case, on the left, they won awards for having the best mustache and the best beard, the longest one. And the one on the right, oh, sorry, skipped that. The one on the right is Kangaroo Court. You can't really see it, but there was a kangaroo court that every week would meet and find somebody who had violated some sesquicentennial law, and they were put into this makeshift jail and brought for a public punishment, which is usually a dunking in some sort of a pool. So this was a very important part of growing up in Corinth, observing the sesquicentennial. So I have an entire chapter on that and how small towns celebrate their history. In the class of 1969, assembled here in May, graduating. The next day, Monday, I went to work International Paper Company in the beater room. And this is a visual of the mill about that time with this enormous stockpile of spruce coming towards you. And finally, this is the beater room here. I spent the summer working there, and that was a building that dated back to the 1880s. And this is the site of the mill today. It was demolished. It was shuttered in 2002, demolished in 2011. And there's nothing that remains of that except the original administration building, which was built in 1905, which I helped to be placed on the National Register of Historic Places back in 2016. So anyway, that's all I have to say. And I guess, Mitch, you want to take it over from here?
Well, I
Sorry
hope
if I
you'll.
went too long. Go
No,
ahead.
not at all. I hope you'll keep talking.
Yeah.
I can't really take it over because you're the expert, but
Any questions? I guess I'll take any questions people have.
yeah, and as people have questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A. There's a little box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll field questions for the rest of the hour. I guess where I was hoping to start is that one of the things that I think is remarkable that you note in this book, and you've mentioned elsewhere, is that there really is not a definitive history of the pulp and paper industry in this region. And considering the importance that it once played, that really seems surprising.
Yeah. Well, the best book on the industry was written in 1971 by a Maine historian, David Smith, and it was a history of the paper industry in the United States. And one of the things he notes in that is that there really isn't an early history of the early companies. And what happened basically is that once wood pulp was accepted by paper manufacturers as a substitute for cotton rags and straw, the industry moved to where the wood supply was and where the power sources were: New York State, Maine, Vermont, parts of Massachusetts, New Hampshire. All of those companies were relatively small, but in the 1890s, there was a consolidation movement. And so you had these large companies forming like International Paper Company that bought up, in their case, 18 small companies. The histories of those companies were absorbed by International Paper. So they're almost unknown. In fact, David Smith wrote that we have no history of any of these early companies. So I will say I'm working on a book right now on a history of the Hudson River Pulp and Paper Company. I've been working on it for the last couple of years, researching it for quite a while. Hopefully, we'll remedy what you're saying. It's only one company, but it was the most influential in many ways. It was the largest consumer of pulpwood in New York State. Had at one time that mill was the largest employer north of Albany, if you can believe it. But in any event, you're right, that history hasn't been done in part, I think, because the forest products industry has really suffered tremendously in the last 20 or 30 years. But from 1820, as I said before, from 1880 to 1920, New York State was a leading producer of pulp and paper. In the 1920s, what happened was that the industry shifted to Canada and to the South because technology was able to utilize southern pine in ways that it hadn't before 1920s. Labor was less expensive down there. There was more wood. There was water power. And so the industry shifted in terms of producing newsprint, which is what was produced in Corinth from the 1870s until the 1920s. There was a period in the 30s when they got into different kinds of like papers for can labels and so forth until they seized on the coated paper in the early 1940s, which was for magazines. But yes, you're right. It hasn't been done. I hope to finish this book sometime this year, at least about one company, and it should help to remedy some of what you're talking.
So the book has both a title and a subtitle, and I want to ask about both of those. And let's start with the obvious one. The book is called The Beater Room Boys, as you describe it right after you graduated from high school in the summer of 1969. You went to work in the beater room. What was the role of the beater room? What did you actually do there? It sounded pretty interesting.
Yeah, so basically, the beater room, the primary function of the beater room is to take wood pulp and to process it with the necessary chemicals and bleach to get it the right consistency for each order of paper. So, for example, each machine, and that when I was there were three principal coated paper machines, 3, 4, and 11. And depending on what the orders were, the pulp going into those machines on what they call the wet end had to be a particular consistency, it had to be a particular quality. And the beater room was a place where the pulp was mixed to the right consistency. I never did any of that. These are guys who were skilled who'd been there for a long. The crew just took paper that was recycled paper. In other words, if an order was sent back by a customer, or if there was an error in production and the paper was no good, it failed inspection, we would process it back up and rebeat it so it could be recycled.
And it came out of the ceiling, right? It started piling up in these big piles.
So we have sometimes we just had these rolls of paper that we had to put in this big cutter that would cut the paper up, which I describe in detail in the book, and it would be processed in this big digester. But the number 3 and 4 machines had when the machines broke and the continuous sheet was severed, that paper would break and it would go down through the floor of the machine into the basement. And we would be called down into the basement where it was like 120 degrees and have to push these mountains of paper into this big digester. And we would just be, try to avoid it at all costs. Some nights we would go to work and we wouldn't be called into the basement at all. But sometimes we were there for a long time. I write of one episode, we were there for an entire 8-hour shift, pushing paper and mountains of it. The number 11 machine was making a mile of paper every 2.5 minutes. These other machines were a lot slower, so we might have had a mile of paper in front of us in 5 minutes. And so it seems daunting, but when it's pouring down through the ceiling in these big sheets, 160 inches wide or so. So it was that part wasn't a lot of fun. But our job was basically to get paper that was rejected or broken paper back into the hopper to be recycled, to be reused again. So that was what the beater, in my name, the beater room boys was just a term that I came up with. We weren't called that. We were called beater helpers was the term.
And that term replaced a more pejorative term from
Oh
before
yeah,
that.
yeah, a broke hustler. Yeah, a broke hustler was a pejorative term that was used, and it was. I mean, there were skilled jobs. A head beaterman was someone who was in charge with finding the right consistency, setting the valves, and putting the right stock in, and the bleach and so forth. So those were skilled, high-paying jobs. But beater helpers or hustlers, and that's basically paper that was broken up and had to be recycled was called broke because the paper broke. So that's where that came from.
Even though that it doesn't sound like it was glamorous work, you really describe it as being you were fairly fortunate to have a job
Oh, for
like
sure.
this.
Oh, for sure. Well, I went back and I found pay stubs from that time, and I was getting paid 3 times the minimum wage. So I had friends who were working at Storytown in Lake George, or they were working maybe in a local store in town or the Grand Union for minimum wage. But the because it was a union job, these were all union jobs at that mill, and so I was making 3 times minimum wage. And as I write in the book, in one place about working overtime, working a 16 when someone failed to show up for work, you had to work if he was your replacement, or find somebody to work for you. But if you decided to work, you would be working another 8 hours where you would get a 4 hour overtime pay. And if you worked certain days of the week, like a Sunday or a certain shift, you would get double time. So the pay was really quite extraordinary if you really wanted to work. So there were people that worked, 3 or 4 days a week, 16 hours a day, because the money was just so good, especially for college. If you, I think one of the last days I worked there one summer, I worked three 16s, and my pay at the end was double what I normally would make in a basic week. So.
Yeah. We have a question that someone asked, a gentleman named John Grotto, who writes, I worked in the beater room at Georgia Pacific in Plattsburgh in the summer of 1972. And he says the work consisted of a huge beater which beat the bark off pulp logs. Another worker and I placed the 4-foot logs in front of a huge saw blade to cut them in half. The 2-foot logs then floated by in a water trough. We picked up the 2-foot logs using a pike, put them in a very hot oven, which melted the logs into a liquid to make paper plates and cartons, etc. The hot pulp often splashed out of the oven onto our forearms. Was your experience at all similar?
No, I didn't have any experience. That sounds a little bit like I did spend one vacation working in the wood room at the mill, and that was a room where you had these huge steel chambers with knives on the inside that rotated pulp with and removed the bark. And so it would go in one end and go through this big, huge chamber and come out the other end. It would fall not in water, but on a big, heavy belt, 4-foot pieces of wood. And our job was to find the ones that didn't have the bark removed. And we would take a big peavy, a hook, and pull it off a belt into a slide that would then go back into the barker. That was called a barker. So what he's talking about sounds interesting. I don't know that they did that at this mill. It may have been a different process, but there's another process. It's called chemical pulping. Corinth mill did that until 1968, where wood would be broken into chips and then cooked in a digester with sulfuric acid and other materials. So there was mechanical pulping would be broken down, and then chemical pulping, which would break it down chemically. They did both at Corinth, but that was the pulp was already done by the time it came to the beater room. The beater room was just to get it to the right consistency and right flavor, so to speak.
I want to get back to the
Sure.
work that went on at the mill itself, but before we get there, I wanted to ask about the other half of the title of this book, which is growing up in an Adirondack mill town. And you touched on this at the very beginning of your presentation, but I gather there has long been a resistance among many people in Corinth to think of themselves either as an Adirondack town or a mill town, let alone an Adirondack mill town.
Yeah, I mean, when I grew up, I don't think anyone uh, self-identified as being from a mill town. I mean, looking back at it as a historian, after, having taught history, college history for 45 years, I don't know what it is. It certainly was a mill town. And that's not necessarily a pejorative term either. It was an industrial town. It had 1,700 manufacturing jobs at one time. It was a very prosperous community. And I just started listing some of the attributes of it. I won't go into more detail. The Adirondack side of it, I always thought when I was a kid, I had one friend whose father they had a camp on Long Lake, but the Adirondacks, as we saw it, was someplace else. Now, in the second book, the Reflections book, which I finished last year, I get into that a little bit because what I discovered was that Corinth had a fish and game club. As I mentioned earlier, we were talking off before the show, back in 1904, which was common in New York State in community. And these were mostly shopkeepers, businessmen who really were conservation minded, and their idea was to promote conservation, but by doing it by stocking streams with as many trout. They even stocked the Hudson River with walleye pike. They put 100,000 walleye pike in the Hudson River one year. So they were stocking the woods with pheasants. They were stocking it with rabbits. But early on, it was called the Corinth Fish and Game. And then by 1920, they changed it to the Adirondack Fish and Game, which without any justification, they just changed it. And that was a common throughout the state. It was, Keene, Adirondack fish. So every community had used that name. And then by around 1930, they dropped Adirondack from the name. There was a period when we talked earlier when the Sacandaga Reservoir was built before it was actually filled, and it had a capacity for recreation. The state did a traffic study, and they predicted that the traffic along old Route 9K, which was now Route 9N, from Saratoga to Corinth to Hadley to Luzerne all the way up, traffic would increase by 200 or 300%. They said these communities should prepare to economically take advantage of all this traffic. So there were civic boosters in Corinth who wanted to do that, and they did call themselves the gateway to the Adirondacks. Of course, when I looked in it, I found 8 other towns also called themselves the gateway to the Adirondacks at that time. And at some point, I'm not sure why or when, I haven't really tracked it down, but at some point, that interest dissipated. And I can't, I mean, the only thing I can think of is that, we were close to Lake George. Lake George was always a vibrant summer touristy place long before Saratoga developed the way it is now. And then in western Corinth, up in the mountains, are three beautiful lakes: Hunt, Effner, and Jenny Lakes, which are clearly Adirondacks Lake. They're just over the mountain from the Sacandaga Lake right now. I don't know whether there was some interaction with folks who had summer camps up there who came into town. I have some sense of it's all anecdotal. They didn't really like people who came and spent summers there, who came into town and, bought their apples from under them, or they just talked differently, or they had different kinds of cars. I don't know. It's all anecdotal. But at some point, there was a disinterest in self-identifying as Adirondack. The men in Corinth in particular, and I say women too, because I have photographs of women hunters back in the 50s, were active hunters and fishermen. they would regularly come back from various places, in that, like Speculator was in North Creek, or Stony Creek as well, were great hunting destinations for these guys. So they took advantage of that. But I don't think they ever identified with living in the Adirondacks, even though it was just in the margin of the park after it expanded in 1931. So it's still a mystery, and I don't really have explanation other than just anecdotal, you know, uh, comments I've heard over the years.
Well, we have lots and lots more questions
Okay.
to get to. A couple of people actually asked this. Where did the you had that picture of the enormous stockpile of spruce, for example. Where did the logs come from? How far did they have to come to get to Corinth?
Well, that's an interesting question. So, over time, they came by railroad. So the Adirondack Railway came through Corinth in 1867, and the tracks are about a mile plus to the west of the village, almost probably 2 miles to the mill itself. So some came in by then. They also came by horse teams. So that Hudson River Pulp Company at one point employed 50 sets of teams, 50 teamsters, so 50 men with horses and wagons who were dragging wood from either the train station through the village of Corinth to the mill on dirt streets, or coming from the mountains in the Cateros range, bringing wood from those mountains. The Hudson River Pulp Company did buy property in the mountains. They were harvesting their own wood locally. So some came from there. At some point later, and I never traced this out, this is more of a 20th century international paper era. It came from Canada. Some of the pulpwood came from Canada. Over time, there have been a number of tariff issues about tariffs on imported pulpwood, and it's so complicated that I've never gotten into it. It's a later period that I'm interested in. But in any event,
And fortunately, tariffs aren't really an issue with Canada
no,
anymore.
but wood pulp, wood pulp, and pulp wood, because Canada had so much of it. And so anyway, it came from all over. And you when I was a kid, you would go down to the mill if you went to work or to the mill at 7 o'clock, or show up at 6 o'clock for a 7 o'clock shift, 6:30 for a 7 o'clock shift. There'd be wood trucks lined up along Palmer Avenue waiting to get into the mill to get their logs weighed at the weigh house. So they came mostly by train, and then also by truck, but early on they came by teams. Eventually, the Hudson River Pulp Company built a spur line from the main line to the mill in 1888. So they built it and they leased it back to and it wasn't Adirondack Railway. It was probably Delaware and Hudson. I can't remember which the history of that, but yeah. So they built it at their expense.
A couple of people are curious about this. How does or did the paper mill in Corinth compare to the one in Ticonderoga? And do you have any sense for why that mill has survived all these years
I
versus the one
don't.
in Corinth?
I don't know. All I know is that mill was built in 1965. That mill replaced another mill that used to be called the Lake George Mill. It was called Lake George, but I'm not sure exactly where it was, but it was in that proximity. But it never was not called Ticonderoga. It was called Lake George, and it was built in 65, 64, 65. And that was one of the warning signs. I mean, when I wrote about that, there were the company was investing in all these mills in Maine and New York and so forth, but not at the Corinth mill. And as I point out in the book, that the mayor, they went on a publicity campaign trying to get the owner of the company, the president, to build a mill in Corinth. The tie mill, I don't know. I don't know much about it. I'm surprised that they've hung on this long. I'm not sure what they're producing right now, but I think they may be the only one left in New York State, as I recall. Because IP at one time had something like, I don't know, I have a map of all the mills. They had mills out to Niagara Falls. One of the interesting mills that I don't know too much about is Piercefield. The Piercefield, New York mill, that was actually a company town. And International Paper built that in Piercefield, New York, right in the middle of the Adirondacks in the early part of the 20th century. So Corinth might have been a mill town. Piercefield was a company town.
A couple of people are also interested about what has happened since. We have one question from an anonymous attendee who says, "You may not have been present in the community, but can you speak to the hardships created in Corinth with the demise of papermaking in these mill towns in the 80s through the 90s?" And the one in Corinth obviously closed in 2002, and how the community has recovered, if it has, from the loss of papermaking. And Roxanne writes to ask what the lifeblood of Corinth is today.
Well, it hasn't recovered. There's been, I guess it depends on your point of view. If you live in the community, you have probably one point of view, although I know people in town who are very clear-eyed about the situation. But when the mill closed, there were 275 people working. I was there on the day, and actually I filmed that final day for the manager of the mill who had invited me in, and I was helping to document some of the historic materials there for preservation purposes. There was a lot of hard feelings. There still are hard feelings about International Paper Company, pulling out when they did. It hasn't recovered. It hasn't. It doesn't have a manufacturing base at all. I can't cite the data, but it's been written about in like the Albany Times Union and other newspapers about some of the economic adversity and hardships. The community, as far as I know, I spent a lot of time. My mother lived there. She was alive till 2014, so I was going back almost every week to attend to her, but also doing research and trying to trying to get a museum going and trying to mostly get the original International Paper Company building put on the National Register. As I said, we finally did that, and it's the only building in the town of Corinth that's on the National Register at this point. So that was a starting point, but there really wasn't any groundswell of interest to support and follow that up from a historical point of view. And I don't know. I think from what I understand, it's really become a bedroom community. I know it suffers some real estate decline in values. Then in 2008, there was a devastating fire in the downtown. It leveled 5 downtown buildings that were vacant for I don't know how many years. The other thing that makes it a little bit more sobering is that Corinth has lost much of its streetscape. I write about this in the Hudson River Reflections that beginning in 1960, a lot of buildings, either when they were burned down, they were replaced by parking lots, or buildings were demolished and new buildings were pushed back from the street. So there's been a significant change in the physical appearance of the community by virtue of the fact that the town didn't have any zoning until 2004. So that's been an issue since the 90s. People tried to get control over growth and development. And there was a lot of pushback, from what I understand, on the zoning side of things. And then regional planners have come in and offered a couple of visions for the renaissance of the community. And as far as I know, not a whole lot of those suggestions have been acted on. But I think mostly there's people that I know, I read about, they're trying very, very hard to re-energize the community. But from an economic point of view, there's nothing similar or remotely like the economic base that International Paper provided. There's no industry, whatever, at this point. Again, other people who live in town can speak better to that, but it's been a tough slog. And if there's a tri-state agency that oversees administration of grants, I can't think of the name of it now, for communities affected by the demise of the decline of the forest products industry from Maine to New York State. So there are many as in the region that have been devastated by the loss of the industry, and Corinth hasn't fared well, as many of them haven't.
At what point was the writing on the wall for the Corinth plant? Lee writes and asks, when did the or why did IP never invest in any other technology machines after number 11?
Well,
It seemed like the writing was on the wall for a while at that point.
well, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think that, well, for example, when I was there in 2002, they were closing it. I spoke at length with the mill manager, and we were in his office, which was on his third floor, looking down. And I said, "Did the company ever think about putting a new machine in?" And he said, "Oh yeah, we talked." And he motioned his hand down here. It would have cost $1 billion to put a state-of-the-art machine in that plant in that time. And by that time they had already sold off the hydro rights to Niagara Mohawk, I believe. They sold the power plant, so they weren't getting energy, their own energy. They were buying it by that point, as far as I know. So I'm not sure. I think, it slowly declined. In the 90s, they were trying to find new markets. They were struggling to try to keep the machines going. I wasn't involved much then. I came in mostly after the mill closed. I just happened to have a sabbatical leave that term. I was working on another project, and when I heard that the mill was closing, I decided that I needed to put that project aside and go over and see what I, could do. And I've been working on it ever since in terms of the early history. But I'm not sure where the turning point was. I think that the Corinth had the workers there had a tremendous uh, reputation for being expert paper makers. In fact, there was talk at the end of turning the mill into an experimental mill for International Paper Company, where they would test these new procedures and test these new machines. But I think the infrastructure was just too old. I mean, the number 11 machine, a state-of-the-art machine today, produces 4 times as much paper per minute as that machine. And that's how different the technology has improved since 1958. So, I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. I mean, but I think that, it's just a question of time. And I think International Paper Company probably kept it open as long as they could with profitability. And I also think there was some nostalgia there. I think they recognized that that was the only link they had to the original company. Corinth Mill was the last one of the original 18 mills that formed the company. So I think there was a regard for that history, but I think economics overruled nostalgia.
We're running a little low on time.
All right.
We'll probably go for another 5 minutes or so. I wanted to get to another question that Sean asks, and he's wondering, do you have a story you can share about your time working at the cemetery, or an observation about the cemetery? That is where his family's plot is located.
Oh wow. Okay. Well, I have written about it in a book, but I basically when I was we finished ninth grade, which was 1965, the priest asked me and 2 of my friends to paint the cemetery fence. And so we spent 3 weeks scraping the fence, priming the fence, painting the fence. In fact, when I went online the other day to try to take a photograph of the cemetery, I realized they had torn that old steel fence down and they put some plastic fence in its place. I was going to use a photograph of that tonight. But anyway, I worked for 3 or 4 weeks. And then when we finished, the priest, I think it was Father Walsh, asked me if I'd like to be the cemetery caretaker. So I started working
As a freshman in high school.
yeah, exactly. So I took care of the cemetery, and then I was mowing the lawns with a regular lawnmower. I think I was bringing my father's mower up in the back of his trunk, and he would drop me off and then pick me up 2 hours later. So I was doing that, and then when I was doing that, the only story I think I tell about that, other than the fact that at some point a parishioner donated this big Gravely tractor, and I had to use that, which was really an unwieldy thing and made more problems than it solved. But anyway, one time I was using a hand mower on a sunny day, probably in August, and I fell through a grave. Literally the ground collapsed underneath me, and my right leg went down into the ground up to my hip, and I hit something. And I was a little bit more amble than I am today, and I was able to bounce out of it, and I was terrified. And I sort of ran away from the hole, and the lawnmower is still, going, and I suddenly crept up and looked in. It was still dark and I couldn't figure it out. So I just packed up and just I had enough for that day.
I think you're right.
But no,
You never mowed around that one gravesite again.
I never touched it again. It wasn't in very good shape anyways, mostly dirt, but it was in a sort of strange spot. But no, I mean I did that for about 2 years.
Yeah.
And then yeah, and then I moved from there. I moved on. I think I worked at the Grand Union with the supermarket downtown. So I had 4 different jobs when I was in high school, and I think I spent the summer of '68 working the Grand Union. In the whole senior year in high school, I worked part-time in the evenings and on weekends
Yeah.
in the produce section or stocking grocery shelves. And so yeah, but I don't have any. The funniest story is the one with the falling into the grave, which was
Yeah.
wasn't funny at the time.
A number of comments, and I just wanted to read them so that you have a chance to hear from some of your fans out there. Lorraine Arney writes, "I was glad to hear you say you'll be doing history on the mills. That's great. I graduated from Corinth in 1967 and often wondered why there wasn't more history written. I think getting the mill office on the historic register is very important." Anthony Antonucci writes, in 1969 through 74, I had a parallel summer job at Bethlehem Steel Mills south of Buffalo as a sweeper in the foundry. My 7 uncles all worked there, and guess what? Almost all my male cousins worked there as well. It inspired me, along with the Vietnam War, to stay in college and graduate. One thing, though, is that the job paid well, $7 an hour compared to a $1.40 minimum wage job at a
Right.
supermarket. And he
Exactly.
says,
Right.
thank you for this session. Um, let me see. Dorothy Hathaway Forbes writes, this is more of a comment than a question. My great uncle Carl Gentz married my great aunt Bertha Diedrich, and they moved to Canada. I have a news article about his career that might be useful. I graduated from CCHS in 1955, the granddaughter of Carl Diedrich and the daughter of Art Hathaway, the first commander of the VFW in Corinth. P.S. Your contributions to the town that I still love are impressive and enjoyable.
Thank you.
And another couple, Roxanne says, thank you for doing this. So interesting. And Elaine writes, thank you for another interesting hour. I have family in the Adirondacks and always enjoy the history these folks share. So much history that so many don't know about. Thanks to both of us for the talk. Before we wrap up, let me ask you one last question, and that is, would you describe Corinth as a good place to grow up in the 50s and 60s?
Oh, sure. Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, people of my generation, when I look at social media posts, which I periodically do, even though I'm not involved too much except for Adirondack, I have an Adirondack Milltown Facebook page, which I material. I'm really stunned. There's such a profound love for that community the way it was. It's not it's a mere fraction or shadow of its former self, but there's quite a but the alumni association I think is one of the oldest. The high school alumni association is one of the oldest in the country. There's a great devotion and love for the history and for the community, and I've just seen some really wonderful things. But it was a great place to grow up. No one locked their doors. People weren't rich. There was a leveling influence there, which I think I've written about the people. There wasn't a lot of class stratification. There are a couple of Cadillacs here, one Cadillac there. No big houses. So it was a pretty good place to grow up. And I can't speak to it now, but I think that most of the people I knew who I grew up with and in my era, feel pretty much the same way.
I know I said that was the last question, but I had one I had to squeeze in. Sorry,
Sure,
Joe.
sure.
Uh, what did the beater room smell like?
Oh, yeah, it's hard to explain what wet pulp smells like. Well, so I guess I'm not sure you could say it smelled like wet paper. That's a great question. I'm not sure I can explain that. You'd have to know what pulp was like and what you know wood been processed and added with chemicals and sometimes starch and bleach, and so you have the paper industry is chemically a heavy industry. It always has been. So I'm not sure how I've never thought about that. I mean, the town used to have a profound sulfurous smell until when they had sulfite pulping until 1967. So that was a predominant smell in the entire community because they had 5 digesters and all the sulfuric acid, the effluent from the smokestacks what was pumped in the community, and you could just it was a rich and pungent smell, excuse me. So yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure I could explain. That's a really great question. I think I have to think about that. The next book, The Smell of Pulp.
All right.
Smell of,
We'll be waiting. Steven
okay.
Steven Cernick, thank you so much.
All right. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
And Joe Dolan, back to you.
Well, thank you, Mitch. Thank you, Steven. This was a great conversation as always. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. We invite you to next month's program. It'll be slightly different than our past programs. As I said at the beginning, maps are a very important part of our library collection. So we're excited to welcome a cartographer and the owner of Green Goat Maps from Saranac Lake, Ezra Schwartzberg. So make sure to check out that and register for it on our website, theadkx.org/events. We are closed for the winter, but stay connected with us online on our social media channels and through programs like this. A recording will be posted within 24 hours or so. And that's all I've got. So from all of us at Adirondack Experience, have a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.